Welcome to CDCon, the CDF's inaugural virtual conference, and the only conference dedicated to nothing but continuous delivery. We're going to talk today about the changing pipeline when it comes to microservices and how we lose the application. So understanding those challenges will be critical as you move forward and really start thinking about how you're going to manage microservices through a CD pipeline. But first, a little bit about me. I'm Tracy Ragan. I am the CEO of DeployHub. I am also a board member of the CD Foundation. I'm a microservice evangelist. I ride big horses. I have a black belt. I live in a small town in outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and love it. So let's just think about where we're at and what's driving this this shift to what we like to often call a modern architecture. Sometimes you hear it be referred to as digital transformation. Consumers are hungry for data. You and I are driving this. We want data and we want it now. We want our medical records when we want it. We want to be able to log in and get our banking information. We want to be able to vote online. Wouldn't that be nice? We want data and we want it now. We want smarter applications. We want faster applications. We want applications that are fault tolerant. We don't want to log into something and see it down. So consumers are driving the demand for what I like to call business agility. And that new demand requires a newer, faster, and modern approach to architecture that is high performing, fault tolerant, and can auto-scale. These are three critical pieces of what we call modern architecture. And they're absolutely important for creating high performance computing, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. And that's where Kubernetes is. And you know, I'm sure all of you have heard of Kubernetes, but if you haven't, you're probably asking Kubernetes what? Kubernetes is really the foundation of modern applications. And that is because modern applications are more and more being built around containers, and Kubernetes is a container orchestration solution. And as we move from a containerized monolithic application to decomposing that, Kubernetes becomes more important. Kubernetes is an open source product managed by the Linux Foundation, the CNCF, and it's also Greek for the word for helmsman or of a ship or a pilot. So shifting to modern architecture is essential, and this is really what you need to take home. You must shift to this architecture. There is not an option for keeping a traditional kind of monolithic practice for future applications. It is a complete roadblock to 21st century software. You're not going to get the kind of massive pattern matching and massive data science that's needed for what we're going to write in the future. You're not going to have a monolithic solution and autonomous cars, for example. Everything that we're looking at in the future is going to require this new modern fault-tolerant, auto-scaling type of environment, and microservices will be a core piece of that. So microservices are really taking over. They have you know, according to some of these analysts, we're looking at a $1.9 billion market around microservices. That may include some of the new modern architecture software as well, but it's a big market. And there's reasons for it. It's not only important for your modern architecture and building these 21st century solutions, but it also saves a lot of money, so the bean counters love it. There's a substantial operational savings from the use of microservice over physical or even cloud-based environments. And there's an increase in computing power at the same time, so you save money and you increase your power. And that's probably why about 86% of development professionals now say they expect microservices to be their default application architecture over the next 5 years. So in other words, Kubernetes has gone mainstream. When you start seeing cartoons and Dilbert cartoons about Kubernetes, you understand that it has truly gone mainstream. And I really love this one. You know, I love it when he says, I need to know why moving our app to the cloud didn't automatically solve all of our problems. You would let me architect it to be a cloud native application. And he says, well, just put it in containers. He says, you can't solve the problem by just saying techie things. And his boss says, Kubernetes. So what are we really looking at? We're really looking at a shift from monolithic applications to microservice-based applications. We're looking at decomposing our monolith to small functions. Or in essence, taking our static application, our static monolithic application, and I call it static because we do a link step. We create a jar file. To breaking it out to each of those class files being its individual function and living in its individual container and being able to be shared across multiple teams. This is what allows that frequent update and the auto-scaling to meet demand, because you're not auto-scaling that entire whale, you're only auto-scaling a tiny little fish, which is really super cool but super complex. And this is probably what I hear most, is that going to microservice can be a bit scary and daunting because Kubernetes is already complex, and the market is starting to address that. We're starting to get more tools to manage the microservice, or the Kubernetes layer itself, but only about 15% of the companies report a massive success with microservice, and that number needs to increase. Now, what we're really talking about is moving from a monolithic to what I like to call a Death Star. And if you look at Amazon and Netflix, these points are all individual functions, individual services. And the complexity is pretty epic. We're talking about 4,000, 5,000 microservices in these cases. These companies are on the bleeding edge and have taught us how important it is and what can be done to support thousands and thousands of customers in this type of environment. But we do lose the application. That is the biggest problem. The concept of an application version goes away, and over the course of all of our experience, the application version has always been sort of our North Star. Everything we do is based on an application version. And remember, I'm going to say this more than once, microservices are shared across teams and they're deployed independently. So you're thinking of now an application is a function, an application is a microservice. But the application version as a whole, if you're a bank, you're writing a teller application, is still there. We just need to be able to track it, and we need to adjust the CI/CD pipeline to manage this sort of microservice environment. So when you don't manage it, and when you start running into problems, this is the kinds of problems you'll find. Alexandra Noonan, I have quoted her many times. This came from an article out of SD Times. She said, what happened is we would release an update to a library, and then one service would use the new service, and now all of a sudden all these other services were using an older version that we had to try to keep track of which service was using what version of the library. What she's talking about is the struggle of being able to keep track of what the application is consuming and how that application changes over time as a new version of a microservice is updated to the cluster. So we have to evolve the pipeline to be able to track, version, and deploy these microservices. And here's 4 points that we're going to talk about. First of all, continuous integration becomes really a continuous build of a container image. That's going to shift probably the most. Continuous delivery must progress through production. We absolutely must be able to track production updates through the CD pipeline. Right now, when I talk to people, most people are just doing continuous integration, and if they are doing continuous delivery, they get it to test, and very few are making it all the way to production. We can't achieve DevOps at scale if we don't push it to production. We need some sort of automated configuration management to track service to application relationships. That's what's going to give us the confidence to deploy new microservices out to a cluster and know that we're not going to impact anything. Now, I know microservices should be fully backward compatible, and there's a lot of work being done to make sure that that happens, but it doesn't always happen. And then understanding what version of a microservice is running in a particular cluster is also important, because that's the feedback that's required that we need to push back into the CD pipeline. So let's look at what we do now. Just to, level set, continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment. At this first level, this is probably the most important piece of the CD pipeline today, and where most companies have achieved some success, and that is in the CI process. Continuous integration is the point of CI was to make sure that we're checking code in on a regular basis and making sure that we can pull it, check it out, and run a build in less than 10 minutes. We've heard Jez Humble ask us many times, can you do a 10-minute or less build? In a microservice world, we may not have to ask that question anymore. Microservices are small. So in a CI/CD pipeline, what we basically do is continuous integration, which can also be referred to as a continuous build, and that's where most companies are at. Now, if you're doing continuous delivery, you may have pushed it to test. And the one thing that's in common between a workflow in dev and a workflow in test is the ability to do a deploy. There are different tests. Testing does a kind of a unit test. Or development does a unit test. Testing does a functional test. And then the holy grail of moving it all the way to production, which of course may have an approve process and again has a deploy. So when you hear the term continuous delivery, what we're really talking about is the orchestration of the workflows that perform these steps. And there's other steps that are included, like security scanning, and there's quite a few other things that can be added to a CD workflow. When you think about continuous integration and continuous build, you're talking about this checkout and compile step. And when you think about continuous deployment, you are talking about this step where you're pushing to each environment so that a continuous test can run. Okay, so let's just look at what we are doing in CI, because that's going to change a lot. Today, what we do is we use it to integrate code. By merging and pulling these based on the label, we scan for transitive dependencies, we compile and link everything statically in a big WAR file or a binary of some sort, which creates the application version. Right? That's where we create the application version. Sometimes we have its own numbering schema, sometimes we use the build number. At that point in time, we have other work products. Sometimes we have a bill of material report, often called a BOM report. And from that BOM report, we can compare two BOM reports and get a difference report. And in some more mature CI practices, there's the ability to run impact analysis. But what we're really talking about is the creation of a release candidate. Once we have that, good practices, we check it into a binary repository, and then we run a deploy script. And in general, the deploy script is different at dev, and it's different at test, and it's different at prod, which is part of the problem. Now again, I told you I was going to tell you this. There's a game changer here. Microservices are independently deployed. You're not deploying the entire well. You're only deploying a single little tiny goldfish at a time. So that means the CI step is different. What we're doing with the CI step is not worrying about doing an integration and trying to do a 10-minute build. What we're doing is we're creating a microservice that we're going to put in a Docker container. So we start kind of in a similar way. We pull code out of GitHub. We might even scan for dependencies. Let's say you're using Python. You might use it to find Python libraries. You pull all that and you put it in your Docker image. That image then is checked into a registry in a very similar way and deployed into your cluster. Now we repeat that often. We repeat it constantly for each microservice. We don't do one big binary. We're doing small ones, and we're doing it with a high level of frequency. So think about it as, microservices sort of constantly, your CI workflow constantly flowing, and any particular point in your Death Star, it could change at any minute, and each cluster has different versions of microservices that are moving across. This means that we have a highly dynamic application. We still have an application there. A collection of those little tiny fish make up one of your applications. So think about the things that we lose when we don't have an application version. We lose the schema. We lose the ability to talk about it. This impacts testing. It impacts bug tracking, and it even impacts our value stream. So having the ability to track an application version is a critical piece of the new CD pipeline. We still need bill of material reporting. We still need to understand what version of our application, our logical application, is using which versions of the microservices that it's consuming. And remember, when you are using microservices, if you're doing it correctly, they're highly reusable. So your application team may be consuming a microservice that you didn't write, which means that somebody else might, the other teams might push it out. Your application could suddenly act differently and you don't know why. This is the importance of, in other words, software configuration management in a microservices environment, which include things like difference reports and impact analysis. So the concept of microservice configuration management, helps you put the application back together. This is a missing piece in being able to confidently manage literally hundreds of microservices moving across that very, very fluid continuous delivery pipeline that is running at scale. So some of the open source tools that you should be looking at for building out a new Kubernetes CD kind of pipeline. A couple of the cloud native tools that come from the CD Foundation. These are part of our project as both Spinnaker and Tecton. There's other tools like container build and registry tools like Harbor, Quay, and Helm. Some of these are part of the CNCF. And then there are other new tools like Ortelius that are managing the configuration management. So some of these tools will be, these are the new types of tools that you'll be seeing in the future as you start tweaking your CD pipeline to meet the needs of a microservices platform. So if we think about what it will look like, and again, there are many, many steps that we could be adding to this picture, but I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible for today's presentation. But we start very similar to what we would have done in the past. We get a JIRA change request, or we get a GitHub issue, or something that says we have a problem. We manage our code and we get a code complete status and in something like GitHub. That's where it stops being the same and where it starts changing. Instead of doing this full binary build like we used to do in CI, instead we're going to pull the code, create a new image, and register it. And I like to think about that as a new release candidate. Some people will argue that the release candidate comes at the code level, but when I'm thinking about doing continuous deployment, I'm waiting for that binary, that new microservice to be registered in a container registry, because then I know where I can find it and where it needs to be pulled from, and I can track it. Now, tracking is the important part. So tools like Ortelius help establish the logical application versions. They pull code from pull information from the container registry like the SHA. They pull the git commit. They track the CR number. And that creates a new microservice version. That information is what creates a new microservice version. And we didn't talk about it, but microservices, a domain-driven design is important for managing microservices, and you'll start seeing the need for cataloging microservices, sort of the ability to organize them so that they can be reshared across teams. And then tools like this provide your BOM report. They track what application version is using which microservice versions, and they track that across the clusters. It's different from having a registry in a single cluster. This is tracking across the clusters. Now, tracking across the clusters is important because, remember, every microservice version that is new creates a new application version. So you could have multiple application versions running in different clusters, which you will in the same way as you do in a monolithic waterfall dev test prod scenario. It's just that it's going to happen more frequently and it's going to be harder to track. So once you build that out, some of the benefits you get. So these types of tools, these container image builds replaces your monolithic compile and link scripts. Tools like Ortelius returns the application version and gives you insights into how a logical application is configured. Tools like Spinnaker and Tecton, they're your new CD pipeline, and they're going to support that DevOps at scale with, you know, thousands of independently deployable microservices moving through it. And then you're going to still get that feedback loop from your CI/CD pipeline that allows you to track your inventory based on your cluster. And that's what you're going to need to make, you know, you need that kind of data in order to make those data-driven decisions. And I'd like to thank you for hearing me out today, and I would love to chat. If you have different opinions, I would love to hear those opinions. I speak to people all day long and ask them these kinds of questions to hear what they're up to. And what I'm hearing is that about 40 microservices is where they start running into problems. I'd like to hear where you're at in your journey and where those problems might be showing up. You can reach me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. Here's my calendar. I'd love to chat with you if you'd like to schedule time on my calendar. And you can also reach me at Tracy Ragan at DeployHub. Or you can just simply dig in at deployhub.com or go to ortelius.io. Thank you.